nobody's ashamed about the fact that they're not very good at, like, mathematics. They actually laugh about it and say, oh, yeah, I suck at math. There's something about handwriting that is so personal, so potentially artistic, and so potentially a reflection of who we are, that if we write and we don't like our writing, it is a hard thing to look at.
From NCPR, welcome to Northwards. People, ideas, and conversations from and about Northern New York, Vermont, and beyond. I'm Mitch Teich.
Support for the Northwards podcast comes from the J.C. Steinecker and M.E. McDonald Charitable Fund at Adirondack Community Foundation in support of the Adirondack Community Foundation, building stronger Adirondack communities. When you threw out your back the last time, what did you do?
I think I sneezed.
Yeah, that'll do it. This is the first time I've ever done anything like kind of cool and thrown at my back because I was riding my longboard. I was struggling to find parking at the Utica train station.
For your longboard?
Yeah, longboard exclusive parking. No, for my truck. And the only parking spot that was available for like long-term parking was at the very end of the parking lot, like as far away from the train station as you could get. So I thought, well, I have my longboard and I'm taking it with me to the city. Why would I walk to the front door when I can just roll in style?
He's like Marty McFly, people.
I'm exactly like Marty McFly. I was going to make a crass joke about my own mother. I won't. I will resist that.
He's like Leah Thompson, people.
Nope, I'm not going to do it. And 3 kicks on my longboard proved to be too many for my back. Yeah, I felt a flaring pain in my lower back. And then the most troubling part, the most potentially embarrassing part is I got into the train station and I'm just like hobbling. You know, I'm like, basically the wind is knocked out of me. So I find a spot, and it's the spot that I'm sitting in is directly across the way from the police officer that is serving as the guard of the train station, right? And I pull out my overnight bag, which has my toothpaste and toothbrush and deodorant and stuff, and it also has my ibuprofen in it. However, in order to save space, I wasn't using a bottle of ibuprofen. I just had a bunch of pills poured out in a plastic bag. So
crushed into a fine powder.
Yes, exactly. So across the way from a police officer, I'm digging into this bag of like loose pills and just hoping he doesn't make eye contact with me. Because if he had come over to question me, I would have been completely out of sorts. It sucked.
You know, the only time I really remember throwing my back out in a really cool way was actually the first time that I lived in the North Country.
Okay.
And this is going to involve Radio Bob.
Oh, okay.
For Radio Bob, for people who are listening to this podcast and are not familiar with his work, he was our longtime engineer. He still hosts an R&B show on Wednesday afternoons on North Country Public Radio. He still helps out with engineering. He is our bookkeeper and kind of the heart and soul of North Country Public Radio.
I agree.
And he has been here since 1730. No, 1980.
He was just laying in the ground waiting for the building to be erected.
I think we found a program guide from North Country Public Radio from 1981, and he was already hosting his show from 3 to 5 on Wednesday afternoons. Anyway,
literally since Wednesday afternoons were invented.
Right, exactly. So when I worked here from 1996 through 1998, I think this would have been the spring or maybe summer of 97, Radio Bob convinced me to be a ringer along with him on the political science department softball team. And it was the last inning. I was going to say the 9th inning, but I'm sure we didn't play 9 innings. Maybe we played 5. And I was playing third base. There were 2 outs, and a guy hits a rocket down the third baseline, and I dive for it, come up with it cleanly, get up to throw to first base from my knees. My back goes out as I throw the ball to Radio Bob, who is playing first base.
Did it make it?
It made it to Bob, who then dropped the catch.
No! Oh, my God. So you threw so it looked great.
It
you
looked
threw
great.
you threw your back out for nothing.
Yeah.
Which has nothing to do with handwriting, which is the subject of today's
Nothing to do with handwriting,
conversation.
except that had I gone to the hospital afterwards, I might have had to write something on a form. But I didn't go to the hospital. I'm sure I treated it with ibuprofen and walked around like a question mark.
Yeah.
Question marks, which are also part of handwriting. So we're talking about handwriting.
I like your handwriting.
You know what? Here's a dirty little secret. I like my handwriting too.
I love my handwriting. At first, my handwriting has evolved. When I was in high school and even in college, it was really crappy and scratchy.
Well, I feel like it evolved. I feel like all of that is just the basis for what your handwriting will become when you were an adult. If your handwriting at 35 or in my case 56 looks like it did in high school, you've done something wrong.
Totally. Or you just don't
write.
You don't write anymore. You're using your phone. And I think that's one of the reasons that people's handwriting is devolving.
So I'm going to, it's not really a name drop, but.
Drop the name. Who cares?
So there's she's an Americana artist, maybe alt country, named Tift Merritt. She had a mild hit back in the 90s, and she continues to perform and get airplay on the stations that play stuff like that. Anyway, I was a fan of her work, and I did an interview with her in Madison, Wisconsin, sometime in the early 2000s, and we really hit it off. And one of the things that she was doing at the time was launching a podcast. Really early in the podcast game, and asked if I would critique it for her.
Oh, cool!
And so I put together kind of a form and hand wrote my comments. And she emailed me, and the first thing that she said was, "Wow, you have really cool handwriting." And the funny thing was, I had thought exactly the same thing about her hand. I think her handwriting blew me away. We had this sort of share. It was the moment at which I realized that my handwriting wasn't just it was distinctive.
Yeah.
I think and like good or bad handwriting. I think it's a really subjective thing, but to have distinctive handwriting, I think, says something at this day and age because most people they aren't writing that much.
No, not barely at all. And there's a very fine line between Dr. or Professor Messy and legibly distinctive.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think you have legibly distinct handwriting, and so do I.
Well, yeah, I would agree. So I think it'll be impossible for people to listen to this interview that we're about to hear without thinking about their own handwriting. And the thing that, honestly, after the 45-minute conversation I had with Tim Brookes about his new book about handwriting, the thing that sticks in my mind the most is that I finally remember the word for what it's called when two of your letters connect. It's called a ligature. Mm-hmm. And I think that's, he reminds us that the word cursive actually comes from the word for running. And that makes sense. And I think, when I think about my own handwriting and kind of when I think about your handwriting, which I don't know all that well, but I think I've seen it enough times, there's sort of a hybrid between printing and cursive.
Yeah,
and
the words tend to run together, yeah.
Some letters are separate and some letters have these ligatures between them. And so Tim Brookes, who we've interviewed before about his Endangered Alphabets project.
Oh, yeah, that's right. Okay, yeah.
Got to thinking about handwriting, and he'll explain how the idea for his book came to be. But his project, which is this book called By Hand, ends up having 3 different threads, and they're all kind of interesting, just like what's being lost in society by, especially in Western societies like ours, which are, seeing less and less emphasis placed on writing things by hand. So, Tim Brookes, thank you so much for making the time, and where are we?
We are in one of my favorite writing places in the known universe. This is Rolf's. So Rolf's is an orchard founded in, I think, 1954. But it also has a bakery and a shop and a kind of cafe. And one of my favorite writing practices is to get up first thing in the morning, sometimes as early as 6, which is when it opens, and come out here and to get a cup of coffee and the house quesadilla done burrito style, or as they call it here, do you want the usual, Tim?
I was going to say, to say you are a regular is an understatement.
Yeah, I love this place. And I should say we are in the burg of Peru, New York.
Which is not far from where you, at the time of interview, reside in Keysville.
Exactly, yes.
Well, before we get started and really talking about this book, I would like to just note, first of all, that my questions have all been written using a Waterman fountain pen. And in full irony, I think you should read what is on the cover of my free notebook that I got at a conference.
Mitch here has what appears to be a customized moleskin of sorts. And on the cover it says FFW, Digital Aspirations Made Real. The full irony of that is going to become apparent over the next few minutes.
Well, thank you for meeting me here, or driving me here. And so we've set the scene where we are, and it's useful to know that because so much of the book that you have written was written here, and also written here by hand. That's actually joining midstream, because in order to do that, you went through kind of an interesting process just finding the right implements.
Oh gosh, yes. So the first sentence of the book, and we're talking about my new book, By Hand. This story begins with 2 photos and shame. Like most people of my age, I grew up writing everything for business, for pleasure, for school, etc. by hand. And when I started working on this book, I actually managed to find a journal of mine from about 1980. And it was, of course, handwritten. And the handwriting was nothing special. It was, it was adequate. It was legible. It was what it was. And then I found another one dating from 1999, by which time, ironically, I had been a writer by profession for 16, 17 years, and my handwriting was awful. And one of the things that I've discovered in researching this book, in talking about the book, in doing mailings about the book after it came out, is how many people's first response is, I have terrible handwriting. And that comes with a sense of shame, which is very interesting. Shame is a very powerful emotion. And nobody's ashamed about the fact that they're not very good at mathematics. They actually laugh about it and say, oh yeah, I suck at math. There's something about handwriting that is so personal, so potentially artistic, and so potentially a reflection of who we are, that if we write and we don't like our writing, it is a hard thing to look at. And that's really where the whole thing starts.
Not only does it seem that your handwriting and the handwriting of many people has gotten worse over the years, but there's also been less call for it.
Yes, and in a sense, my handwriting has become what I used it for, which is to scribble notes as a writer, as a journalist, etc. And about 5 or 6 months into working on this book, I asked myself a question that I had never asked myself before, and I suspect most people have never asked themselves, which is, when did I start actually enjoying the act of writing? Because obviously I enjoy writing. I've had a great time. I've written 20 plus books, etc. But the act of writing by hand was never something I enjoyed or thought you could enjoy. And I think many people are in that situation. So
Why do you think that is?
A lot of it has to do with the way in which writing is taught. I cannot tell you how many people tell me I can't write because it's painful. because my fingers get cramped, because I have to hold the pen like this. And then there's the people who, literally or metaphorically had nuns who wrapped them over the knuckles with a ruler, The act of writing is taught as if writing is a necessary life skill, rather than an art or an opportunity for self-expression or something that you could enjoy doing in your own way should you want to. Which is weird, because if you think about knitting, so knitting is also like a domestic technology, a traditional manual domestic technology. But ever since the beginning of knitting, the assumption has been that even though there's mechanical necessities for getting the thing to hold together, there's also the colors of wool, the patterns, and a sense that somebody who knits is knitting their way to an end that they have chosen. And writing and mathematics are not taught that way.
And as you discover through the course of researching and writing this book, there is a lot that is individual and creative just about the sheer act of writing itself.
So the book really has three threads going on. Maybe I should step back and sort of set the scene.
Sure.
One thread was actually my original purpose for writing the book, which is I had discovered that through my work on the Endangered Alphabets Project, that there are minority cultures around the world that are working on cultural self-preservation and revival by teaching calligraphy, especially cultures whose script, in other words, their alphabet, their writing system, has been banned or marginalized by some kind of government or oppressor. And so to teach their kids, or even their adults, to write in their own script by hand is a transforming experience, because it connects them with their older generations, with their ancestors, with their aesthetic traditions, often with writing that they've seen on the walls of their temples, but they've never actually been able to read, for example. So the second impulse was that as I was gathering information about these various cultures in Nepal, in Indonesia, in the Philippines, I realized that exactly the opposite is going on in the United States, where instead of our writing practices drawing people closer together, they're actually separating the generations. So we have the younger generation using tools that the older generation can't understand, and at the same time we have the younger generation not being able to read the writing that has been used for centuries. And I thought this is actually a really timely issue, because we are in the process, and the United States even more than any other developed country, in the process of diving into these digital tools and the use of AI. And we're doing so without really understanding what it is that we're throwing away. And that's why I decided to write the book by hand, was to discover what it is that we're throwing away. And the act of writing the book by hand turned out to be the most revealing and most surprising element of all.
Well, yeah. So let's talk about the actual tools, because there was some auditioning of specific implements you did, and a chance for you to visit some really remarkable places, most of which were in New York City.
Yes. So from the very beginning, I noticed that I hated writing with ballpoint, because there's no what's called stroke weight. However you write, whichever direction you're going, however much you press, the line is exactly the same width or thickness. And because of the carvings that I've done for the Endangered Alphabets Project, I've really sort of immersed myself lovingly in the sweep of a beautiful curve, and you just can't get that with a ballpoint. I could sort of get it with a pencil, and I experimented with at least 8 different thicknesses and hardnesses of pencil. But the problem with a pencil, even though I enjoyed it, is it's really very faint. And at the beginning, my aim was to actually print this book photo reproducing my own handwriting. And the pencil just wouldn't work for that. So then I went into the craft shop, Michael's, and discovered they actually have a kind of bottom of the line calligraphy pen. And it came with 5 cartridges in different colors, which was like, here is this realm of pleasure that I had never thought to try. And you discover that there was a particular ink that went on sort of pink, but as it dried, it became this wonderful kind of autumnal rust brown color. And you sort of go, this is the kind of thing that we're losing, that we're forgetting, that these are all dimensions of writing that we could be using. The problem with that pen was that its nib was so broad that it left so much ink per square centimeter of page that it actually was kind of hard to read. So yes, eventually I bit the financial bullet. I said there is no expense too great for this book, and drove to Brooklyn to a stationery shop called Yoseka, which is a Japanese word, and it's run by a couple, an American-Japanese couple. And that was absolute revelation, because there they had, okay, so which of these 16 different kinds of paper would you like? So there's this paper which has more sizing in it. So sizing is a fancy word for glue. And so the more sizing there is in the paper, the less the ink soaks in. And so it sits up on top of the paper and it catches the light in these really interesting ways and makes it three-dimensional. And then they had 20 different calligraphy pens. They had fountain pens they had to lock away in a case because they were costing up to $8,000 a piece. And that, frankly, I was not that dedicated to this book. I raised the funds by Kickstarter, and I didn't raise $8,000 for a fountain pen. So yes, there was a period of probably 2.5 months of experimenting with different papers and different journals and different pens. And
now that sounds like heaven to me, honestly.
It was heaven until you realized that what was happening already was that I was putting a phenomenal and kind of unconscionable amount of pressure on myself. Because by saying, I'm going to take my really scribbly, scrawly, crappy handwriting and improve it to the point where we can photocopy it and print from that and people will be able to read it, that's sort of like saying, Mitch, we know you've injured your ankle, but we want you to take part in this triathlon next Thursday. You better get better quick. So what happened was that more and more, I enjoyed the act of writing in my journal, but increasingly the pressure of feeling other people see the imperfections in my writing. It was so astonishing, it virtually made me grind to a halt. Like, at one point, I was feeling that I was a fraud. I mean, I've written, I think, 22 books and God knows how many articles and whatnot, but it felt as if every one of them, I had written them, but then somebody else had said, it's all right, mate, don't worry about it looking so crappy. We will typeset it and you'll look like a real professional. I have never felt so naked. And in fact, at one point I wound up in the hospital because I was having these things that were almost certainly anxiety attacks, but I thought they were heart attacks. One of which happened right here in this building that we're sitting in. So this is real radio, folks.
So should I hope you're drinking decaf there?
Yes, exactly.
But it is really interesting, your process and what it told you about the way you think when you write, because honestly, I thought that was one of the most interesting parts of this book was the intersection between what happened when you wrote by hand and when you, in the end, your editor just said we can't print this book in your handwriting. But what happens between the time that you think of the words, you put them down on paper, using your hand and the time that it ends up on your laptop.
Yes. So just to clarify, I carried on writing by hand, but then I would copy it and then edit it on my laptop. But yeah, I want to tell you 2 stories, both of which happened at Rolf's, which are great illustrations of the actual nature of handwriting. So the first one was, I came in here and I started out by doing some editing. So the computer is a great device for editing. I have no problem with that whatsoever. So if I'm taking stuff from some kind of source material and I'm moving it around, that's great. And then this alert came up on the screen saying, the upgrade or the update is available. And I thought, this is great. I normally never do the updates. They're supposed to happen in the middle of the night, but I have got the thing unplugged or whatever. I will let my laptop update with the latest OS or whatever it is, and use that opportunity to write in my journal. And so I set the thing going and I opened up the journal and I discovered I couldn't write. And the reason I couldn't write was because, without really knowing it, my kind of internal rev rate, especially when you're editing on a computer, where editing, frankly, you can do quickly. You got to go, oh, cut, paste, bang, bang, do this here, etc. Your metabolism, or your cranial metabolism, is just going so fast that when I sat down to write, my principal priority as a writer, even though I didn't know it, was to get to the end of the line as fast as I possibly could, which is the perfect recipe for terrible handwriting. And it probably took me 25 minutes before I had kind of settled down to that state that as a writer you want to be in. The other story was, once again, I came here in the morning, I had my laptop, I had my journal, and I had forgotten my pen, my beloved pen, which is now my sidekick, my companion. But as always, as I'm driving here, and this is also an interesting feature of brain activity, as I'm driving, because driving occupies a certain part of your consciousness, but not all of it, it's a great opportunity for you to be thinking and having ideas. So I came in here and I'm like, right, I've got all this stuff I want to write down. Didn't have my pen. Cursed. And I thought, well, that's okay. I'll write up on my laptop. And as I was writing it up, I thought, this is terrible writing. This is like a cross between business writing and note-taking. At one point, I even used bullet points, and I never use bullet points when I write. And I hated it so much that eventually when I got home and I kind of paced around and muttered for a couple of hours, I thought, I've got to do that again. And I got my journal out, I got my pen, I started from the same starting point, and I set to write the same set of ideas, and the writing was utterly different. So it was more fluid, it was more conversational. There was a much greater sense of the integration of ideas with each other. Phrases and images and analogies and memories all started arriving unbidden. And that, to me, is now one of the most interesting aspects of writing that, frankly, nobody understands. And when I finished writing it up, I thought, that is not first draft. That is pretty much final draft stuff right there. That is as good a writing as I'm capable of. So, as you say, so much of this book is about the difference between how we think and how we write in these different forms, how we think, how we think we write. It really is, it's like this Swiss roll here. As you look at it, you kind of realize that there's more and more layers and they're all kind of rolled in together.
The Swiss roll is a metaphor.
There you go.
There are a couple of anecdotes that I wanted to ask you about, and one of them ties directly into what you were just talking about. You spoke with someone, and I can't remember the circumstances, but they were explaining why they like to type and type quickly, and they said something like, because I can do it so fast, I don't even have to think.
Yes. one of the most fascinating things that I discovered is that there has been a ton of research, absolutely solid research done by absolutely grey, hard-working, unimaginative scientists since the early 1980s into the therapeutic effects of writing in a journal. And we're not just talking about, if you're feeling bad, you put it down, you feel better. We're talking about more rapid rates of recovery from major surgery. We're talking about the deceleration of the downward slope for HIV, AIDS, or cancer. It's really solid stuff. I was particularly interested in the question, does it matter if the journal is on the screen or on the page? And I would say a significant majority of the journalers that I came across were writing on paper in a book of some kind. But there were definitely some who were doing it on their laptops. And people who write on laptops, when faced with the kind of discussion that we're having, get very defensive very quickly. I think it's partly because they'll say, this is our tech, don't take it away from us. But this one person was saying, oh yes, I can't imagine keeping a journal, by paper because I type so much faster than I write, and that means I can type so quickly I don't have to think. And I thought, one, if there's one thing that I've learned through this whole process is that quicker is not better when it comes to writing. And two, isn't the whole purpose of keeping a journal that you want to think? So I suppose what they mean is that they wanted to be able to put down what was just kind of running through their mind as quickly as possible. And there may be some therapeutic value to that, who knows? And this leads to possibly the most interesting episode of all, which it's so new and so radical that I'm still thinking it through. And this happened on the Cumberland Head to Grand Isle ferry, like all good ideas.
Absolutely.
So
this is when you went actually inside the cabin to write, right?
Yes, exactly. So normally I take the Charlotte to Essex ferry, but this is dead of winter, it's iced over, etc. So I'm going out to Plattsburgh and I'm taking that ferry, which of course is acting like its own icebreaker. You've got 3 boats running constantly, breaking up the ice. Because I like watching the ice and I'm really interested in the behavior of ice, I went up into the cabin, I had my journal with me, as I always did, I had my pen, and I imagined myself being like an early 19th century sea captain writing in his log. And so I wanted to describe the ice, but I found myself doing it as if I were writing in this, sailing vessel log. And the captain is writing, the ice is all around me like broken china, blah, blah, blah. And then I stopped and I thought, if he were writing like this and describing his surroundings like this, who would he be writing for? And so I kind of go back into the captain, and the captain asks himself that question. He knows the shipping company he's working for doesn't care. They just want to know that none of their goods were lost and they got there on time, more or less. And so he says to himself, I imagine a companion. Who would that companion be? So what he's doing is he's writing, but he's imagining, he's telling this to somebody who's sitting there listening. So who would that person be? Well, it would have to be somebody of equal intelligence, equal kind of similar experience, equal wit. It would have to be somebody who was at least potentially interested, but was not afraid to contradict him. And I thought, this is what we do when we write, because we think so much faster than our pens can move, that it is as if we are listening to ourselves. Within ourselves, we have the captain. we have the companion. And the conversation that takes place between them happens so fast that we don't even realize it's happening. And it's only because I am kind of writing this, sitting on my own shoulder, like looking in through my ear to see what's going on as I'm writing this, that I realize this. And I think this is such an interesting notion. Are there people, for example, whose companion is not interested? And of course, there are people who are so self-critical or so unsure of themselves that they edit themselves out of existence. They don't put a word down, or they don't finish anything. And how do you develop? Boy, there's a great writing course right there. How do you develop your companion to the point where the companion is as valuable to you as mine is to me? So yes, all the way through, especially in the latter half of this, I'm asking this question that I've been now asking for 6 years, and was the central feature of my book, Writing Beyond Writing, which is, what is writing? And in this particular case, we're asking what actually goes on in the act of writing.
I suspect that people, when they listen to this interview, are going to start thinking about their own handwriting and their relationship between, when they write, what it looks like. You learned some interesting things about the actual art, if you will, or the mechanics of simply making letters.
Yes.
The idea that many of us think of handwriting and cursive as synonymous. The way that some cultures think of letters that are separated as being kind of lower class than writing. What are some things for people to think about when they actually sit down and look at something that they've written?
Yeah, so one of the responses that I've been getting already, because the book has been out for all of like 3 days, but I'm getting a lot of feedback already, is a sense of loss and possibly of futility. It's too late for me, I'll never write well. That's exactly where I was at the beginning of this book. It took me 6 months, but I'm practicing, I am thinking about it. I'm doing things like slowing down, being much more conscious of my posture, what my body's doing, all those things. So that's always, you're not going to get there instantly. The second thing is that I'm going to run by you my anti-Scrabble theory of writing. So one of the interesting things about the way we're introduced to writing in school is as if each letter is indeed a separate symbol. So you're in the kindergarten, you look up on the wall, there's a picture of an A and an apple, this kind of thing. And I thought, well, this is really kind of interesting because those are all separate. And it's like Scrabble tiles, you've got your 7 letters, you move them around, you put them down in a certain order, there's a word. That isn't writing. Writing is somehow something different. And even though we write with things that we call letters and we understand as letters, something else is going on. And so the paradigm shifts to what I call atomized writing, where everything's been broken down into its individual elements. But again, that's not writing. Writing, the word cursive means running, right? So there's something about the way we write that gives it movement. And I discovered that if I tried to write an individual letter gracefully, I couldn't do it. I've got this picture in the book of this journal where I wrote the letter G 20 times and hated every single one of them.
And G is one of my favorite letters to write, frankly.
Yes, and I could not do it. And it was because, and this is where, so graphology is normally used in TV shows to mean like, is this the serial killer's handwriting kind of thing. But in fact, if you look at the way you form an individual letter, there's a lot of conflicting forces going on. And a G, if you are holding yourself back and trying to do it really cleanly and clearly and regularly, you're not moving along the line with the rest of the word. And what happened was that as I began getting into this more and more, I started discovering that my writing was cursivizing itself. So the question, I can't write, or I'm terrible at writing, is something that some people say when they mean, I couldn't write a short story, or whatever, so they're talking about content. And there, it's actually, what is stopping them is a much more complex issue than it seems, because it actually requires multiple different united skills to do that. The same is absolutely true of handwriting. And so when someone says, I can't write, and they mean, I can't write, gracefully or fluently or whatever, they are actually massively underestimating what is actually going on in the act of writing. And in fact, the more they are uncomfortable with their writing, or it's physically painful, or they're ashamed of it, the more likely they are, and I know this because I did this in the book, to stop trying to connect the letters and just trying to do this letter, this letter, this letter. And at that point, that is such a drag that who can blame them for then saying, you know what, I'm just going to do it on the keyboard.
What did you learn from your experience as a cursive interpreter for the Library of Congress?
Smithsonian.
I beg your pardon.
National Archives. I learned several things. So even before I started working on this book, I saw that the Smithsonian, which as many people know is like a whole family of institutions or museums, had put out a call for people who could read cursive so that they could transcribe and index documents in the National Archive. And my first thought was, I've got to do that. That sounds like a really interesting thing. And plus, I like doing journalism where you kind of throw yourself in the middle of it. So I learned several things. One was that this is a snafu of epic proportions. There are literally millions upon millions of these documents. They have apparently several thousand what they call citizen archivists who are working on this. They were all going to be dead long before the second box of these documents is done. So how did we get into this situation? Well, one of the reasons we got into this situation was because in our priorities for developing computing skills, optical character recognition and the ability to read something as subjective and graphically complex as handwriting was somehow not as high a priority as working out the telemetry necessary to get a rocket to hit another rocket.
It's kind of staggering to think about.
Yes, our priorities, let's face it, the first desktop computer that was widely available in the early to mid 1980s in the United States was made by a company called International Business Machines. The drift from the very beginning has been toward writing as a commodity, writing as a tool for doing business, that kind of thing. So to me, as I was looking at this Sisyphean task of dealing with all of these documents, and the fact that these game and plucky volunteers were doing their best, it just totally reminded me of what happened in the Second World War when the British Expeditionary Force and the French army were trapped at the Belgian port of Dunkirk, and 300,000 people there were trapped between the advancing German armies and the sea, and they could all have been wiped out. And the British government put out this call, if you've got a boat, go there and save some. And hundreds upon thousands of small boats went across the channel, and they pulled 300,000 people off that beach. It really feels to me that this is the same kind of appeal. We shouldn't be in this situation in the first place.
The other thing you found out is that, wow, the National Archives has some boring documents.
It does have some boring documents, and yet the boring documents may well be what history is all about. So, for example, one of the, in order to make this whole process seem more like an adventure, they have divided the massive holdings into what they call missions. And so you choose a mission. And one of the missions was documents to do with Japanese American internships during World War II. And I thought, this...
Internments.
Internments. Not internships, right, internments. Given what is happening in the country in general, and the kind of the xenophobia that was let loose and institutionalized at the beginning of World War II for the U.S., this seemed like very grimly ironic. And as I started looking at some of these documents, I realized these should be up on school walls, because some of them were as simple and bureaucratic as lists of possessions. And you kind of go, were they allowed to take their possessions with them when they were sent into camps? Did they leave them behind? And if so, were their houses and apartments looted? Were their possessions confiscated? And you sort of go, this is the kind of thing that a bright 9-year-old, say, for example, is going to go, oh, wow, this is history coming alive just in this one tedious bureaucratic document. So, it is the kind of thing that clearly we ought to be doing and we ought to be paying attention to. But even as I was doing it, the very people who were employed by those institutions were being summarily fired by executive order.
Well, Tim Brookes, it's a really interesting book. I enjoyed every word of it, and I'm so grateful we got to talk about it.
I'm so grateful you got to come here and got to see Rolf's from the inside.
Tim Brookes is the author of many books, the most recent of which is called By Hand. It is just out in the last couple of weeks. I met up with Tim Brookes in the town of Peru, New York, at Rolf's coffee shop and farm market, where he wrote a lot of the book. Tim Brookes, you can see some examples of his handwriting and more at ncpr.org/northwards.
So I mentioned at the top of the show that I was in New York City visiting my friend John, who works a lot with pen plotting devices, makes a lot of art that way. So it's attached to this rig that has an arm that you can put different pens in or brushes or whatever the project calls for. And then the computer tells the pen plotter to move in a certain direction, and after many, many hours creates this piece of art or handwritten whatever. So
it's like the drawing equivalent of a 3D printer almost.
Kind of, yeah. So he has been working on this project. He, for as long as I can remember, has been obsessed with having a font of his handwriting. He has a very distinctive handwriting as well. And what he's been doing is handwriting things over and over and over again to create a large enough sample size that he can create a font that looks as though it is handwritten. Because if you only give it one A and then one lowercase a, it's going to use the same one every single time. But certain words certain letters have different ligatures between them, and certain letters flow into another letter differently, depending upon how they appear in the word. So he's trying to give his computer a big enough sample size that he can ultimately generate a font that looks kind of random enough that it appears to be handwritten.
And seriously, it'd just be cool to have a font of your own handwriting.
Exactly, super cool. I've always thought it would be fun to to put out an album that's got all handwritten lyrics that accompany it, but each one is just a little bit different.
So if you were going to have a font based on your handwriting, what would it be called?
Arrogant Jerk. I think it would be called Arrogant Jerk.
Mine would be called Doofus.
What's your character that you annoy your family with?
Bart Bartson.
Bart Bartson, that's right. Bart Bartson.
Bart Bartson would be a good name for font as well, although it'd have to be a more annoying font than my handwriting. Well, signing off here. Ethan Chanty, tell us who produces this show.
Northwards is an NCPR podcast production. The show is written, produced, and edited by Mitch Tyke with digital production supervision by me. I'm Ethan Chanty. Bill Hanel is our Director of Digital Services. Caitlin Kelly handles our social media, and Doyle Dean is our production manager. Our theme music is by the Wickmore Jazz Trio of Plattsburgh. You can find out more about this show and support it by visiting ncpr.org/northwards. This is NCPR North Country Public Radio.
No auto pens were used in the production of this program.
Oh, God.